Welcome to the Black Archive Safer Home Virtual Series. My name is Louis Berthen. I am the Assistant Archivist. And today we're going to be doing my segment, which is called Legacies, Profiles in Greatness. And we are going to be talking about an outstanding man who fought against injustice here in Miami. His name is Dr. Elmer A. Ward. This is a photo of him here. And he was a doctor and he was a sergeant. So he was an outstanding man. Dewey Knight, a longtime friend of his, said this of Ward: he was slight of stature, but strong in commitment and fearless in getting out on limbs. And that, quote, he had a burning passion to improve the plight of the black people in this community. So the comment about being slight of stature, Elmer A. Ward was actually 5'4" and 130 pounds. But he was a small man who made a big difference in our community. All right, if you'll stick with me for that. All right, so Elmer Ward was born in Charlottesville, Virginia on July 27th, 1891. His birthday just passed. He was the grandson of former slaves and one of 11 children born to David and Florence Ward. I found very few details on his early life, but what I did find is that he graduated from Howard University Academy in 1912 and then attended the University of Toledo, where he received a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry in 1922. And he continued his education and graduated from the School of Pharmacy in 1924. So now he's a doctor. So while he was in college, he joined the Marcus Garvey Pan-African movement, and later he joined the NAACP. This paints a lot of what he knows, and it's going to show up a little bit later in his life. According to him, he was actually able to continue and complete his education thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a branch of the federal government established during Reconstruction for education of former slaves and their children. He had also served in the U.S. Army. He achieved the rank of sergeant and was honorably discharged in 1918. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any records of whether he served in Europe or not, so I would assume that he only served here in the States. So he married Anna Belle Ward, and together they had one son named Charles Odell Ward, whom they adopted. And hi, Harmonious Birthing. Thank you. All right. Elmer Ward came and settled here in Miami in 1926. He was around 35 years old. And when he got here, he said of Miami, quote, "I found this area in 1926 one of the most segregated places I had visited in the South." End quote. And if that doesn't give you pride in your city, yeah. It's actually unbelievable. I mean, considering how many other places in the South and when we learn about the Civil Rights Movement, everyone talks about Georgia and Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina. People don't usually tend to think of Miami in that conversation, but here it is. So Ward, now a registered pharmacist, in 1929 opened the Economy Drugstore, which was located at 1101 Northwest 3rd Avenue. The Economy Drugstore, as told by Ellie Thomas, was believed to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, drugstore owned by a black man in South Florida. This store employed about 8 people in 1942 when Thomas wrote the article. So Elmer Ward was an activist, and he pushed for equality in all parts of life for various peoples. In an interview in 1975, he stated, quote, "For 50 years, I've been involved directly in every program available to me to make whatever contribution I could to about a greater degree of human liberty and respect. I don't believe in violence, but I've been militant since I was 15. I'm a nonviolent political activist operating on all fronts that affect the black community as well as the poor of all ethnic and religious groups." I love that statement. So one of his earliest movements and organizations was actually to get out the vote and get the people of the Overtown community registered to vote. So when he arrived in 1926, like I said, he was stunned at how people of color were treated here in Miami. To quote him, "I was totally disenfranchised. I came from Ohio, where I was registered as a Republican, but in Florida, I couldn't register at all." In 1930, he said that at the time, only 5 or 6 of the most influential black people were allowed to vote here in Florida. So to quote him about what he did, "I was part of the group of black people who thought that the way was to register as a Republican because the party handpicked a few blacks as tokens for the upcoming national convention." So, a quick aside, we had actually seen this with a couple figures that we've talked about before. We never talked about D.A. Dorsey on this show. But we have talked about R.E.S. Toomey, and we both of them were heavy Republican proponents. They both served in delegations that went to the national conventions in Chicago in 1920, I believe. But what we didn't see is how much of an actual effect they had. So Elmer Ward talking about this kind of gives a little more insight into that. So this is quoting him again. "We sent a small delegation and asked to be seated so that we might be heard. We let it be known that blacks were discriminated against. We went through the proper procedure to be heard. We came home and functioned in our limited way as a Republican club in Dade County. And after we challenged the Republicans for tokenism, then we looked around to see if we can challenge the Democrats." End quote. And they did. So, circa 1939, according to Ward, he helped organize the people from Overtown and the Overtown community to vote. And this was done in spite of threats of the KKK here in Miami. Again, if you didn't know, the KKK were very active here in Miami. So, and this is specifically about the 1940 election, okay? So, they told the people of Overtown not to vote under threat of death, essentially. So they had been active in this election trying to scare the black community by parading down the main street. They were 75 cars deep. They were handing out cards with threatening messages that said things like, quote, "Respectable Negro citizens are not voting tomorrow," end quote, or, quote, "N-word, keep away from the polls," end quote. Another thing that the KKK of Miami did was that they hung effigies to symbolize lynchings, okay? And one example, they actually lynched a dummy and hung it over a power line, and they put a sign on that and said, quote, "This N-word voted," end quote. However, and thankfully, these scare tactics failed miserably. Apparently, according to Ward, over 8,000 blacks from Overtown voted in that election. So, it was a good success story, in spite of all the fear that was trying to be incited by the KKK here in Miami. So, Ward didn't stop there. He also served as one of the original members of the executive board of Greater Miami's Urban League, and he served there for 15 years. After L.E. Thomas, a man that we've talked about on the show, I don't know if you remember, he had actually sued the county to get black men to sit on juries here. Once that went through, and that was obviously he won that suit, the first man to actually sit on a circuit court jury here in Miami-Dade was Elmer Ward, and that was in 1942. So the case he sat on was, interestingly, a paternity case. I think the end decision was that the man had to pay $50 a year to the woman for his child. So Ward was also one of the forces behind the opening of the Virginia Key Beach, along with Reverend Gibson and many others. So again, for those who don't know, Virginia Key Beach was actually the first colored beach to be opened here in South Florida. Before that, there was no place that people of color could go to the beach. However, hopefully you guys caught the virtual field trip from last week. That was an excellent video. So you can watch that. That was done by director Timothy Barber. So after we're done here, maybe you go back and watch that video. It's a beautiful place and it was a really great time. So another thing that Elmer Ward did was that he fought against discriminatory practices in public accommodations. He was actually a member of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. He was one of the first black men to eat at a white-owned restaurant in Coral Gables, which was a very heavily segregated neighborhood. He also led a campaign to sit at a white-only theater. Ward and a couple others demanded entrance, and when they were denied, they took the matter to the courts and were successful. This led to the opening of all local theaters to all races. So, and just to bring it kind of a little to modern times, if you are one of the Hispanic people who does not believe that the plight of the black community affects you in any way, I'd like to point you back to this lesson in history. The thing that these men fought for are things that we all enjoy today. So, just a quick aside. In a similar fashion, he was also one of the men, along with Garth Reeves and his brother-in-law, George Odell, that fought to have the Miami Springs Golf Course integrated in 1957. So these men together formed the CGA, which is the Cosmopolitan Golf Association, and they started fighting for integration. Miami Springs was a city-owned course that was denying entry to black men, citing that they would bring down business. The group, and right before this, so the year before, the county had made a promise to open a golf course on a sewage site that would allow for black men and women to play 3 days out of the week. But that project never got started, and therefore these men decided to go and try and integrate the Miami Springs golf course. So so what happened is these men went to the golf course, and the course manager wanted to turn them away because of the color of their skin. So he contacted one of the city managers, and the city manager told him, you can't do that, so make up something else. So what the city manager said was, made up a rule, everyone needs their own equipment. All right, so they leave, then they come back fully equipped. The group was allowed to play, and that was early in the week. So they were allowed to play that whole week uninterrupted with no problems. Enter next week. That Monday, the city of Miami passes an ordinance that only allowed black players, that restricted them to play on Mondays only. The reason given for this was because the course manager said business fell 50% due to the black players being on the course. However, this was untrue. It was quickly disproven by investigative reporting by the Miami Times. So the CGA, after this ordinance was passed, attempted to play on another weekday. I believe it is on a Wednesday. And when they were refused entry, they similarly took it to the courts. However, this was not an easy process. So when the case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, they actually upheld Miami's city ordinance. The Supreme Court upheld a racist law. The Florida Supreme Court, okay? G.E. Graves then takes it upon himself and appeals it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And here they decided in the golfers' favor. They didn't even hear the Miami lawyers' argument. They ruled it was unconstitutional. They vacated the decision and sent it back to Tallahassee. So Miami Springs is now integrated. However, this is not without some cost. So George Odell, who was Elmer Ward's stepbrother, was actually a caddy at the course. And when he got involved in the suit to help break the color barrier, they fired him as retaliation. And they told him that he would never work there again. And he didn't. So, continuing, Elmer Ward, one of the most important color barriers that he helped break was actually one of the banking industry. He became a member of an advisory board and later became the vice president of the First Federal Savings and Loan Association Roosevelt branch. Ward also founded an organization called the Dade County Young Democratic Organization. He was a charter member of the Sigma Alpha chapter, the first Omega Psi Phi fraternity chapter here in Miami. In 1976, a $3.6 million apartment building meant for the handicapped and elderly people of our community was built and named the Ward Tower in his honor. And that is located at 2200 Northwest 54th. And so for everyone who's joined in, hello. And I'm talking about Dr. and Sergeant Elmer A. Ward. So just a quick recap for the people who joined in. He was a critical member in integrating the Miami Springs golf course. So incredible. And one of the men who is critical also in integrating the local theaters here. So continue. So Elmer Ward retired from pharmacology in 1955, and he dedicated himself to political causes and he continued to fight for purposes that he believed in. A friend once talking about him said this, that he was, quote, tenacious. Once he got involved with something, he never let go. And so Ward lived to be about 100 years old, and he died here in Miami in 1991. So I have a couple interesting little facts about Elmer Ward. So when he passed away, the former Miami mayor, Maurice Fair, actually canceled the trip to Venezuela to pay respects and be at the service of Elmer Ward. He said, the amazing, highly educated, kind, and generous American with strong opinions. He was also my severest critic. When he didn't like something, he didn't hesitate to call me and let me know. He inspired me, which are very kind words. And this is another little interview I found. So when he was around 80 years old and the Black Panthers were gaining in popularity, Elmer Ward said this about them, quote, they are not all right and they are not all wrong. but I'm just a bit too old to join them, which I think is a really interesting insight into what he believed. And again, for those who joined in, I just want to read his quote again because I think it was phenomenal. So this was from an interview in 1975. For 50 years, I have been involved directly in every program available to me to make whatever contribution I could to about a greater degree of human liberty and respect. I don't believe in violence, but I've been militant since I was 15. I'm a nonviolent political activist operating on all fronts that affect the Black community as well as the poor of all ethnic and religious groups. So now, because I know this was a little bit short today, I actually wanted to do 2 profiles, and I have a really quick one on his wife. So we are covering more women. All right, so this is a newspaper article written on Anna Belle Ward. All right, so let's start. Anna Belle Ward lived in 3 centuries. Her 100 years spanned the end of the 19th century, all of the 20th, and 54 days of the 21st. From the horse and buggy to the sport utility vehicle, from the telegraph to the telephone to the fax machine, Ward saw it all. Ward, who marked a century of living with a big bash in September, died Wednesday while recovering from a hip injury. Longevity is a family trait, her relatives say. We seem to be lucky in that respect, said nephew Hunter Odell. Many people will remember Mrs. Ward, the English teacher at Booker T. Washington High School and grade school teacher at a Liberty City Elementary School. Many will remember Anna Belle, the co-owner of the Economy Pharmacy at 11th Street and Northwest 3rd Avenue in Overtown, who with her husband, Dr. Elmer Ward, operated the business from 1927 to 1951. But just about everyone knew Miss Ward remembers how nice she was. Ward, the oldest of 3 children, was born in Topeka, Kansas. She came to Miami by way of Detroit 7 years after being one of the first African Americans to graduate from Teachers College in Detroit. So that is a notch under her belt. Sorry. Ward taught for 5 years in the Detroit school system before coming to Miami with her husband, and the couple opened Economy Pharmacy. Ward returned to school and began her teaching career at Liberty City Elementary, then taught at Booker T. Washington High. Later, they adopted their only son, Charles Ward. A devout Catholic, Ward helped found St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church, which began in 1929 as a storefront chapel behind the pharmacy. The church, located at 1682 Northwest 4th, has grown and now boasts a private school. St. Francis Xavier, I'm pretty sure, is one of the first Catholic churches to be opened in the Overtown community. So, and that is also due thanks to the work of the Wards. So Ward, a parishioner for 70 years, was also an honorary member of the Knights of Peter Claver's Lady Auxiliary. She was also a longtime member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority and the Gamma Zeta Omega chapter. So Ward's husband died in 1991. Her brother Bernard moved to Miami to be with her, her nephew said. In addition to her son, brother, and nephew, Ward is survived by nephew Ed Odell, education reporter at NBC6. So that pretty much covers me today. That covers the Ward story. I'll take any questions that anyone has. I appreciate everyone who joined in. SGT Tyanson, thank you. Swamp Maid, Luberthan, thank you. And while I'm waiting for a couple more questions to get in, just please stay safe. Everything is looking a little dire these days, but all we can do is our best. Please wear your mask. You know, coronavirus ain't no joke. And it doesn't look like I'm getting any questions. And MJ, I appreciate you. I know it's a lot of bad news these days, and you know, history lessons don't tend to be very positive things, but we can glean positive things from them. So yes. All right. So unfortunately, there's not going to be a virtual field trip tomorrow, but make sure to tune in for Storytime in Color on Saturday with Camila Pridgett and our very special guest from Harmonious Birthing. So thank you guys. That's going to be very exciting. I hope to see you guys next week. Please stay safe. Appreciate you. Bye.